Good morning, everyone. Let me make sure it's recording. Great. So today we're going to be talking about Node. So we're going to start coding for the backend, and then Express, which is the framework that we'll be using. So first, in order to use anything like from other libraries or from your own code, you're going to have to learn how to export code from a Node module. And so the command to do that is module exports or exports. And what that is, they're both pointing to the same object at the time of a creation of a script, and that's whatever object is going to get exported at the end. Module exports is actually what actually gets exported, but exports is like an alias for it. So at the beginning, they're both pointing to the same object. And if you remember, objects are stored by reference, so they can do that. But just beware that if you point exports at something else, like if you write a function and then say exports equals that function, then they'll no longer be pointing to the same object. And then module.exports is what will actually get exported. So you'll end up exporting an empty object rather than the function that you wanted to. And then on the flip side, in order to import into a Node script, you use the require. And so if you pass it a local path, then it'll go find that in your directory. But if you pass a string, it'll look into your node modules directory. So we can do a couple examples of how to do that. So here, you can do something like module.exports is a function that just console logs hi. And let's do vim import. And then you can do like var say hi gets require. Then how do you get to the local directory? You do / is your current directory, and then export is the file that we created. And so notice you don't have to do a .js because it'll just assume it's a JavaScript file since we're already writing a JavaScript file. Then you can go ahead and just execute it. Oh. And it goes ahead and executes it. But notice, if we instead did exports, say hi is not a function because it's an object. Do you see why that would happen? So on the left, or on the right, we have exports equals function and console log hi. And if you remember, at the beginning of that script, we have module.exports referencing an object, an empty object. And then we have exports also referencing that same empty object. And then what do? We create a new function. And then we update exports to actually reference that function. And so it's no longer referencing that. And then what actually gets exported? It doesn't really look at exports. That's just a keyword for you to use. It actually exports module.exports. And so even though you intended to export this function, it actually exports the empty object. And then so when we import it over to there, we have var say hi gets empty object. And then when we try to execute that, it'll error. Cool. Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah.
So then in what case would you use exports?
It just saves you a little bit of typing. So say you're actually creating an object, and say you're exporting a person. So like first name gets John, last name gets Doe. Instead of doing module.exports.firstname gets John, module.exports.lastname gets Doe, it's a little bit easier just to do export.firstname gets John, exports.lastname gets Doe. So if you're creating an object using dot notation, it just saves you 7 characters every time. Cool. And so node modules, so we touched on that, we mentioned it a little bit right here. What node modules are is they're similar to libraries in C or libraries in Python, and you're free to import them into your scripts. And so there are more than 350,000 modules in the NPM registry. What NPM is, it's the node package manager. We'll talk about it in a second, but it's a hub for a lot of code and a lot of libraries that people write. They're all open source, and then you can go ahead and import it into your code and start using their libraries. And so how do we install them? Using NPM. So the node package manager is a way of automating installing, upgrading, and removing modules. And the way to install packages is npm install the package name. And if you use the -g, then you install it globally rather than just in a certain directory. So if you just run npm install express, for example, that installs express in your current directory. But if you do npm install -g express, it installs it for the entire computer. So there are certain tools that you might want to install globally, but most things you just want to install locally so that you are sure to use the same version. Because if you want to use different versions in different projects and you installed them globally, you might get messed up there. And then you can manage your own config file within a file called package.json. So what is package.json actually? It defines the configuration for your application. The full documentation you can find at this link, and I'll post these afterwards. But we'll talk about like the most important tags. And so what it is, it's a JSON file, which stands for what? Yeah, so it's pretty much just a JavaScript object, but it's pretty strict in how you can actually write it. So there are no comments, you can't do stuff like that. And so you define scripts in a scripts object, and you define some metadata like name, version, and author. Name and version are the only two that are actually the only two properties that are mandatory, but everything else is highly recommended just because it helps you keep track of what you're doing. And then you can track dependencies and dev dependencies. So let's look at what a package.json might look like. So over here is one that I just wrote. And so if you see, it's just a pretty large object. And we have a name called test. If you're actually publishing to the NPM registry, it needs to be a unique name. But since we have this private true, that means we're not going to be pushing it up to NPM. So we can go ahead and name it whatever we want. Version 0.0.0 because we haven't actually done anything. And as you iterate, you want to increase that version number. Author, my name. And then scripts here is an object. If you see, it's just a JSON object within a JSON object. And what it does is it allows us to alias certain commands. And so we'll talk about what grunt does and what npm actually does later. But I found myself writing npm install and then grunt publish a lot right before I would kind of check out what code I wrote. And so rather than typing that in every time, I just aliased it to an npm script. So if I wanted to run that script, I just do npm run whatever the script name is. And in this case, it's build. It won't work because there's no grunt installed, but it tries to. I'll go ahead and abort because there's not really any use. And then dev is just another one, and we'll talk about those tools in a little bit. And dependencies, if you notice, it's a bunch of, these are called Npm packages. And so these are the ones that I might have wanted to install for whatever project I was working on. And then these ones are ones that you install to help you develop, but they're not necessary when you actually put something in production. And so say we wanted to add to these dependencies. We could say, look something up on npm, find, say, async, find the release number, and then go ahead and stick it in. So like async, and then a version number. You can do tilde, and it'll say, don't care about that exact one, just make sure it's the last dot. So it's a large number, the middle number, and a smaller number in terms of like the importance of the new build. So like if you increment this last number, it means it's a small fix. If you increment in the middle number, it means it's a more important fix. And if you increment the first number, it means it's a large fix and it might actually break backwards compatibility. And so by using the tilde, it means don't care about this last number. If you use the caret, it means don't care about that second number. And then if you don't put anything there, it means it has to be that exact version. So generally, tilde is fine because if they fix any bugs, you'll want to include that. But if we do that and then go ahead and run npm install outside of here, then it'll go ahead and install all of those packages that we listed. But it might be a pain in the butt to go look up the version number for every single thing we want to ever install. And so a shortcut to do that would just be to do npm install -- save, and then whatever module you want to use. And what that does is it looks it up for you, finds the version number, and then actually adds it to your package.json for you. And it keeps it all organized in alphabetical order. And so this is probably the better way to do it, especially if you don't know the alphabet like I do. Okay, so npm commands, we talked about it a little bit. npm install goes ahead and read that file and installs all of the dependencies that you list. Npm install -- save package does what I just told you. And then npm run, the script name will go look up that script object, look up the name of that script, and then go ahead and run that code. Cool, so now let's move on to Express. Has anybody used Express before? One person? Does anybody know what Express is? Why we might use it? So it's a minimalist web application framework, very lightweight, very fast, and it's very similar to Flask and Python. So I assume everybody's looked at Flask a little bit. If you took CS50 in the last year, I hope you did. But Express is known for its very, very powerful routing system, and we'll get into that a little bit later today. And so let's take a look at what some code looks like. So first, let's look at a Flask file. This is probably something you've seen before. So this is Python, and it's just how you'd write the Hello World app. And so you go ahead and use Flask, install Flask, and then define a route, and define a function that goes with the route. And so now let's compare this to the Express code. So on the left, you see we have var express gets require express, and what does that do? Yeah, so it goes, looks up express from your node modules directory, and then just loads it into your file under the variable called express. And then var app gets express, which creates a new express instance. And then line 4, we do app.get/. What does that look like we're doing? What line of code is it similar to in the Flask? 4, right? What does it look like it's doing? Yeah, so you're defining a route, and where is it listening? Probably at /. And what HTTP method is it looking for? A get one. And so what do we do if somebody does a get to /? We run this function right here. So function that takes 2 arguments, res.send hello world. So you've never seen this code before, but what does it look like it might be doing? Yeah, so res stands for response, and you're just sending a response that says hello world. So let's try running this app. Node Express or Hello Express. Example app listening on port 3000. So let's use our web browser and go look at port 3000. Hello world. So it does exactly what we thought it would do. What do you think will happen if we do slash something like that? So if you look at the code, what's the only route that we have set up? So if we try loading this, cannot get it because it doesn't actually exist. And so Express is best known for its routing, and what does it do? You can do app dot some sort of HTTP method. So what are some HTTP methods? We have get, post, put, delete might be two that you've never used, and then there's a whole multitude of other ones, but those four are the most important ones and the most often used. And then we declare a path, so slash something, and then some sort of callback. So what is a callback function? Anybody remember from yesterday?
The function that happens after the defined function occurs?
Yeah, exactly. So we're pretty much setting up an event listener, so it's listening for something. If it gets invoked at path under a certain method, and if it does, it'll invoke its callback. And so method is an all lowercase HTTP method. Path is a visit path of the URL. And callback is a function that takes 2 or 3 parameters. The first one is a request object. The documentation is here. We'll look at it a little bit later. Second is a response. And then the last is next, which is an optional callback function. And we'll touch on that a little bit later this afternoon. All right, so let's take a look at a more built out app. Where did I put it? Let's actually build our own. So I'm going to go ahead and push some code right now. Has everybody looked at or pulled from the Git repo that I posted? If not, let's go ahead and do that now. So I'm going to push this code here, and then we'll go ahead and start building it out together. All right, so if everybody wants to go ahead and clone this repo, does everybody know how to do that, or do you want me to go through that? All right, so we have a URL here. So is everybody up on this page? If you see over here, there's a clone or download button where you can go ahead and download a zip, opening desktop, or actually clone it onto your own machine. And so if you copy this, you can go ahead and in a terminal window, go ahead and git clone that URL. You don't have to, just wherever you want it to be stored. Do you guys have a question? Were you able to?
So how do you find your GitHub profile?
Um,
The bootcamp website. I think he sent us the thing.
oh, do you not have it?
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah, so go to the bootcamp website, okay. Yeah.
If we try to update it every day, is it the same? It's like equivalent to clone like the whole repo again versus like pulling it.
Yes, but you're essentially recreating an entire new directory, and you're going to have a bunch of different directories with the same or similar stuff in it, so you might as well just pull. But it's pretty much the same thing to just, if you haven't made any commits yourself, to delete the entire thing and then reclone. But I would recommend just pulling. It's much easier. Is everybody able to do that? Yeah.
Wait, so to update it each day, you just do git pull.
Yep. So if you just run a git pull, it'll try to see if there's any new pushes that I made, and if not, then it'll just tell you it's already up to date. Everybody good? And so before you try to run the file, go ahead and run npm install express. And then go ahead and just run it with node hello express.js. And then you can all go and visit your localhost :3000, and it should say hello world for you. And if it doesn't, let me know, and I'll come check it out. Yeah. Yeah.
I did that. I routed your clone. I don't know where it's like. It's now. That's the thing.
So what you did was git init this will create that directory and initialize a repo in it. So you want to run git clone.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're just doing this, like, I'm doing this locally to, this is what I just ran, to the repository, like a repository, your repository. Is that fine?
Yeah.
That's okay.
Did you run just npm install? What?
No, it's on Express, right?
Yeah, that should be fine.
Okay.
This is fatal.
Where are you running that?
Oh, sweet.
Anybody else having trouble?
I'm having trouble with npm. I don't. Should I just uninstall it and reinstall it? Because I have it, but it's giving me an error. It won't give me the version either.
Yeah. can you try? Yeah, can you try reinstalling?
The whole node too.
How did you install it? Did you use Homebrew?
I think I used Homebrew for Mongo.
I, Alright, let me know when that's done running.
Okay.
Does anybody else have trouble running? What are the errors that you're seeing? Warnings are okay. Did you try running node hello express? Does that work?
It says it's already installed. It's just not.
Hold on one sec. Node 7.
Oh.
When you uninstalled and updated things, did you like tell them to save them also?
Oh man.
What does it do there? I mean, does it
Okay, let's try doing this. Okay. Are you guys seeing something about rimraf? What error are you seeing?
Find module.
Which module?
It gives the directory and then hello at the end.
Oh, make sure you're in the correct directory. Does everybody is everybody familiar with Bash and working in a terminal? Or do you want me to go over that stuff too? I'll go over it. Okay. Yeah.
So like I made a boot camp,
Uh-huh.
and when a boot camp like folder, and when I cloned it, it made another boot camp folder.
Yeah.
Should I install the npm in that one or?
Generally, you want to have your node modules as close to the file that you're running as possible.
Okay.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
So if you went ahead and made a separate bootcamp folder, and so whenever you clone, it'll make a new directory within whatever current directory you're in. So if you made a bootcamp folder and then clone, you'll have a bootcamp within a bootcamp. And if you want to, the GUI might be the easiest. If you just do open space dot, it'll open your current working directory from terminal in a thing, and then you can just drag and drop whatever folders around. Does that work now, Catherine?
Node modules is gone, so.
So cd into whatever the directory. Oh yeah, just try running npm-v. Cool.
Yes.
Nice. All right, so I'll do a quick refresher on any bash commands that you guys may need to know. So as developers, you'll be forced into using the terminal at least a little bit. So there are a few commands that you'll definitely want to know. One is ls, which does what? Yeah, it lists all of the files in your current directory. But what happens if you want to change what directory you're in? Yeah, so cd stands for change directory, and you can either give it a relative path, so like ... will go up a folder, and then ls again, and you'll see what's in there. You can also give it an absolute folder, so I can do something like cd // whatever directories I want to go into, and then I'm back where I was. What happens if you want to delete a file? What would we use? Yeah, so rm, so say I created a file, this file A that I want to get rid of. I would run rm A, and it gets rid of it. Be careful with this command because there's no undo button. If you accidentally delete a file that you didn't want to delete, it's gone forever. What happens if you want to delete an entire directory? Or what happens if you want to create a directory first? Make directory. mkmikdir. Well, it takes a path name, so you could say test, and it'll create a new directory. What if you want to remove that directory? Rimdir test, and that goes ahead and delete it. But what happens if we now have something within that? So if we do ls test, it'll list what's in test, and now we have a file in there. So if we want to remove that with rimdir, it'll yell at us, hey, that directory is not empty. And so it's a pain in the butt to go through and into every single subdirectory and delete every file in there. So how do we want to recursively delete entire directories? Does anybody know the command for that? Yeah, rm-r, which will forcibly, recursively delete everything in an entire directory. So be careful with this command because you don't want to delete anything that is important to you. I have this off, but it's possible that if you do rm-r, it'll say, hey, are you sure you want to delete this file? Are you sure you want to delete this file for every single file in your directories? And so how do you shut those up and just say, yes, I want to delete everything? Yeah, so rm-rf will recursively and forcibly delete everything within a directory. I'm not even going to type this command out because it's so dangerous, but what happens if you run rm-rf/ or tilde or something like that? Yeah, you'll delete everything. So if you do rm/rf// it means the root of my hard drive. And so that line would recursively and forcibly delete every single thing on your entire hard drive. So that's a very, very dangerous command. If you see anything on the internet that's like, oh yeah, this will fix your problem, don't run the command. If anybody on the internet posts something like, oh, run this command, unless you're on a very trusted source, don't do it, because you might do something you'll regret forever. What happens if how do we create a new file? Yeah, you could do touch, you could do it in the GUI, you can open Sublime and say, hey, I want to create this file. Almost every single program will be able to do that for you. But if you want to do it at the command line, you can just do touch, touch A, and that will create a new file, A. That's empty. If you want to see the contents of a file, you can do cat A, and it'll print everything out, but it's an empty file, so nothing was printed. If you're handy with any command line text editors, you can just use that text editor to create a new file. You may notice I like something called Vim, which is a command line based text editor, and I can use this to add lines. And then that goes ahead and edits it for me. But if you like Sublime, forget what file I was working in. Oh, so A. So if I like Sublime, I wrote this thing that opens Sublime for me, but you can go ahead and use Sublime to edit things. And then that'll work the same as using like a command-based text editor or anything like that. What happens if we want to put the output of a single command or program and redirect it into like a text file or some sort of file? Does anybody know how to do that? So fwrite would be like how to do it in code. At the command line, there's redirection. Yeah, so like the greater than will redirect the output from one file or one command into some source file. So if we did something like echo hi, all that does is just echoes hi back to you. And say we wanted to redirect that output into the file called A. We could do echo hi redirected to A. What's the danger of doing this? Yeah, so we already wrote some things in A, right? But if we run this, that just overwrote whatever things we had in there. And so say rather than overwriting a new file, we wanted to append to that file. How would we do that? What? Close. Yeah, greater than means append to the end of that. And so if we look, hi was now appended. There are other like redirection type things, like less than takes, it does the opposite pretty much. It goes from the file on the right to the file on the left. And pipe, which is the straight up and down line, which is generally shift backslash. Does anybody know what that does? It's very similar to redirection. It redirects the output of the left file as input for the right file. So the right file actually also has to be a program. But for front-end web stuff or web stuff in general, these aren't really things that you ever have to use. So now, if we're in So if we're in that bootcamp folder, mine's actually called lectures rather than bootcamp, but it's the same folder. If I wanted to find that hello express file, where would I find it? Or how would I go about finding it? So I have no idea what's in this folder, right? So how do I see what's in this folder? ls. So day 0, day 1, readme is just an empty file. What day are we? So how do I get to day 1? cd day 1. I have it set up so it automatically does an ls, but ls would presumably tell you what's in that directory. I don't think, there's no afternoon that exists yet, so there's only morning for you. So we'll go ahead and, how do we get into morning? If you don't know, there's a autocomplete function in terminal. So you can type mo and then hit tab and it'll say the only thing that starts with mo is morning. So I'll go ahead and autocomplete that for you. And then ls again. What directory do we probably want to go into? Exercises does not exist. Yeah, so cd into source. And then now we see the files that we were looking for. And so if I just try to run hello express, what's going to happen? Cannot find module express. So why is that happening? So if we look at hello express, what's the first line? Yeah, we're trying to import express. And if you remember require, if you don't give it a path, where does it look? So if we pass it a path, it'll look for a JavaScript or some other file within whatever relative path you pass it. But if we pass it just a string like we did here, like require express, it's going to look for a particular folder called node modules, which is where npm installs any modules for you. And so since we never installed express into that directory, it's going to complain, or any of its parent directories either. So how do we go about remedying that? Npm install express.
So that means whenever you're installing things using the terminal, you should go to a parent directory first, or is that like best practice? Or?
Best practice is to include all of your node modules as close to the file as you can. So in this case, they're in the exact same directory. So now if we try to run hello express, I already have it running. So if you see this, I don't even know how to pronounce that. It means the port's already in use, so you might have it running somewhere else. And in my case, I do. I start it in this one. So if I close this terminal window and try to run it again here, it'll say, all right, we're listening on port 3000. Is everybody able to do that? Let me know if you have trouble, but I'm going to assume everybody's good up until this point. And so now it's listening for GET requests on port 3000. So how do we make a GET request most easily? Yeah, just visit the website, because if we visit anything from a browser, it automatically does a GET request. So we can go to localhost, means go to localhost, which is anything that's running on my own computer. Colon means, okay, I'm going to give you a specific port. 3000 is the port that it's listening on. And so if we go to this, then it says hello world. Does it work for everybody? Cool, so let's go ahead and start adding some new functionality in there. So I'm going to go ahead and copy over this file so that Hello Express still exists. So how would I go about copying a file? Yeah, there's multiple ways you can do. You can use redirection. So if you do cat the file and then redirect that into a new file, that's one way to do it. But the easiest way to do it is to copy CP, a source file, so Hello Express, and then a target file. And I'm just going to call it app.js. And if you look, now we have a new file called app.js, which is exactly the same. And so the reason I'm doing this is so you can refer back to Hello Express and I don't overwrite it. All right, so let's see if we can start coding without even looking up the documentation, which is bad practice, but we can do it since we have some code to begin with. So if we want to define a new endpoint, how do you think we'd go about doing that? Yeah, app.get something, right? App.get, let's do /hello. And then what? What are we going to define now? Yeah, some sort of callback function. And if you remember from the slides, the callback function, oh, this is for the next. So it takes a request and a response object. And so let's actually just take a peek at what these things look like. So the request object has a bunch of things connected to it, all related to the request that was made to your server. And so you have stuff like the base URL. The body is probably going to be pretty important. If they submit a form, it'll appear on rec.body. Cookies, fresh, hostname, a bunch of stuff. We don't really care about this for now since they're not really sending us anything in our request, especially in a GET request. So we can go ahead and just ignore the request. We know where they're requesting how. So if we define a callback here, and the callback gets fired, how do we know what page they're requesting? Yeah, right here, right? The callback function will only get fired if the /hello page is called. And so you already know exactly what they're calling for. So we can go ahead and do hello, write a function that takes 2 arguments. Generally, we call them rec and res for request and response, but you can call them whatever you want. I would avoid doing this because then the request object will be called res and the response object will be called rec, and you'll just end up confusing yourself. But you can call them whatever you want. You can call them X and Y. You can call them request and response. You can call them A and B. Just remember that it's a function that takes 2 parameters, so you can go ahead and define whatever the parameters names are. And so let's go ahead and just do actually console log hello. And if we save this file and then run the code, so what do you think is going to happen if we visit port 3000/hello? Any guesses? Yeah.
It's gonna log in your console hello.
Yeah. So we said console.log, so let's /hello. Waiting for localhost. Waiting. This is taking longer than we expect since it's running on our computer. It's not like it's fetching a website over at Google servers. It's just asking our own computer. And so let's go see what's happening. So over here we see it says hello at the console. And so an important thing to note is that if you do a console.log within your server file, it'll log it to whatever console you're running the file on. And so since it was this console that we said run the file app.js, it'll console log to this console. But then we never actually did anything with the response. So our user's just hanging here waiting for something. And so we actually have to define what we want to respond with. And so we can figure out what the response object holds by looking at the documentation. And so this is just saying the response object defines what we send back to the requester. You have stuff like res.app, res.headers, res.locals, but the most important one is res.send, because that means send something to the user. And so the documentation says it sends an HTTP response. It can be a buffer object, which don't worry about that. It's just in a bit array. A string, an object, or an array. So that's the important ones. So we can send back a string, like we did earlier, res.send hello world. We could send an object or an array. And it's important to note, if you don't send anything, then the user will just sit there waiting for a response. Because we, as the engineers, know that we're done executing this function, but the client doesn't actually know, because we never sent a response. We just said, hey, I want this page /hello. And the server internally says, okay, I know all it wants to do is console.log, and it did that. But it never sent a response back to the client. So it'd be like me asking you, oh, how was your day? You thinking, oh, it was pretty good, but not actually saying anything. So I'll just be standing there like, what's up, man? And so that's what we did to our client. We kind of thought to ourselves, I'm going to log hello, but we never actually said anything back. So we'll actually have to explicitly say that. So how do we want to send a response? Res.send hello. So what happens if we used X and Y here? Would our code work? No, right? Because res, even though in the documentation it says res.send, the documentation assumes that you call these two things rec and res. And so if you decide that you want to use custom names here, which is fine, You just need to remember that you'll have to use y.send down here. And so let's stick with the standard and use recognize. Yeah?
So for syntax, do we need semicolons or not? Because some of them don't have semicolons.
So in JavaScript, semicolons are not necessary, but highly encouraged. I always use semicolons, but this is actually the Hello app. If you look at the Express documentation, is just something I stole from their website. And so this is the most basic Express server. They chose not to. I always choose to. And for a good reason, in my opinion. So as we talked about yesterday, what happens first when we run like a script? So when we say node app.js, what's the very first thing that happens? Yeah, so the interpreter will read through all of your code first, check for syntax errors, and then load any functions into memory, declare any variables for you. But it reads it character by character. And if it sees like a new line without a semicolon being here, it'll say, oh, I assume they wanted to add a semicolon, so I'll go ahead and add one. But let's see what sort of, there's one bug in particular that this could cause. And let's write a function that returns an object. And let's call this object a person, first name. So this is perfectly valid JavaScript code, right? If I run this, will it error? No. Yes. The interpreter's looking out for me. Anyway, I'm just going to keep continuing and assume there's no errors because it looks like it should be perfectly valid code. And if we did function greet person, so this looks like it should be perfectly valid code. We're defining a function called return person, which returns presumably an object with first name Jordan, last name Hayashi, and then we have a function called greet person, which grabs a person, so var person equals whatever return person returns, which is presumably that object, and we say console.log hello person.firstname. And so if we run it, we already see what happens. It says unexpected token. How could that be? And so let's pretend for a second that we are the JavaScript interpreter. And all we see is not this nicely printed file. We see function return person. So function return person space open bracket \n space. So the JavaScript interpreter actually ignores white space of greater than one character. So it all gets squashed into a \n return \n bracket \n first name dot dot dot. And so if you're the interpreter, you say, okay, function return person, new line return new line. So what happens when you see return new line? So we know, we know that semicolons are optional. And so if it sees something that is a perfectly valid statement and then a new line, it assumes that that was a statement that was supposed to be made. And then it'll add a colon, semicolon for you. And so this actually does this. And then now we see why it doesn't make any sense to the interpreter. It says return, and then we just throw an object literal at you. We don't assign it to anything. We don't do anything with it. And that's actually a syntax error, because we can't just have a number, right? Remember back to ifs, we can't just throw an anonymous function, because that's just a random expression. It's not a statement. Or it's a statement, it's not an expression. It doesn't have any meaning to it. And so it'll actually throw an error. And so how do we remedy this? We would actually have to do this. So if you notice JavaScript syntax, in CS50 we taught you in the style guide to put braces on new lines, but in industry it's standard to put it on the same line, and in JavaScript you do that almost for this exact reason, just because if you don't, you might get these weird errors like this return. And so now if we run this, do we expect it to work? Yes. And notice we still didn't have all the necessary semicolons. So this one was just added by the interpreter. That was a very long-winded answer to the question, but yes, semicolons are optional. So back to where we were. So console.log hello, and then res.send hello. So what do we now expect to see? If we run this and then visit /hello, yeah. So now if we visit hello, it'll return hello to us. So I'm like, oh, what's up? And they actually respond with what they were thinking. So now let's do something more complicated rather than just saying hello back. So we can actually do whatever we want in the function before returning, whether that be computation, whether that be sending requests to other websites or your own database. But let's do something fun like a random number generator. Or let's make a coin flip endpoint. So this endpoint is going to flip an imaginary coin and then print out either heads or tails. And so how might we go about doing that? So we have an endpoint that I'm going to call coin. How do we visit the endpoint? Anyone? How would we get to this endpoint? Just visit it on a browser. And so now let's write a function that flips a coin. So we have a function which takes 2 arguments. And then how might we go about flipping a coin? What are some algorithms we would want to use or could use? Yeah, math.random is a good one. That generates a random number between 0 inclusively and 1 exclusively. But the user doesn't actually know what we're doing. We could actually just do this. and it's a flawed coin flip, but it still will return heads or tails. But let's actually make one that returns heads 50% of the time and tails 50% of the time. So math.random would be a good one. We could do var random number is math.random. And that'll create a number for us between 0 and 1 exclusively. And then how do we want to make the odds 50%? That would be one way. What's the easiest possible way that you could think? If random number is greater than 0.5, then we could do var coin is heads, else var coin is tails. And then what do we want to res.send? I heard the answer somewhere. Coin. So let's save this code and run it. And let's try visiting that endpoint and see what. Tails. 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 This seems. There we go. Heads. Nice. All right, that was fun. So what happens if we want to create other endpoints? So what if we said, rather than doing this, we want to have a coin state that's stored on the server, and then every time we do app.getCoin, it'll tell us what the coin actually is. And then we could do app.getFlip, and that will actually reflip the coin. How might we go about doing that? Could we use the code we have now, or do we have to change it somehow? Does everybody understand what the question is? So essentially, say we have a coin, and if, like a coin sitting on my desk, and if you tell me what is the coin, I'll just say, oh, it's heads. If you ask me again, oh, it's heads, oh, it's heads. And then it's not until you tell me, oh, flip the coin again, that I'll reflip it, and then you can say, hey, what's the coin? And I'll be like, oh, now it's tails. What's the coin? Oh, it's still tails. What's the coin? Oh, it's still tails. So how do we implement that on a server? Yeah, so we have to store the state of the coin outside of the function. And so let's throw it up here. What might we want to store it as? What are the possible data types? What would be the most efficient data type? Boolean. So let's go ahead and store it as a Boolean and say, we'll say if at first it's going to sit at heads, and we'll call heads true. And so now what does app.getCoin change to? So coin will be the get state of the coin. So we can say make sure to always use a slash at the beginning, otherwise you'll never be able to get to that endpoint. And so what would this one be? Huh? So what goes in this function? If somebody asks me, what's the state of the coin, what do I do? Yeah, just say, oh, this is what it is. And so we could do this. But what does that do? It'll send true or false. But what do we actually want to tell the user? Heads or tails. So how do we do that? state. What? Res.send heads, yeah. Else, what? Perfect. So let's go ahead and run this and see if it works. So get coin state. Heads, which we expected. And if we keep refreshing the page, it's possible that it's randomly generating, but the more I hit refresh, the greater the odds that it's actually doing what we want it to do. All right, so now how do we have an endpoint to change the coin state? Let's do change or reflip coin. And what will this function do? Yeah, so how are we going to change the state? Negation would be me just literally flipping the coin, but we want it to be more random, like me flipping the coin. Yeah, we could actually just do this. Reusing code. All right, did that work? You're shaking your head. Do you see a bug? Does anybody see a bug? Yeah, so if we ran this as is, what would happen? You'll never, I heard somebody say never get what? So let's,
You'd always get
why?
because a random string would be truthy because you'd either be going for tails and like get coin state would always be true.
Exactly. So if we run this code, it'll reset coin state to be either heads or tails. But if you remember, we decided as a design choice to use coin state as a Boolean, and then we check the Boolean here. And then if we check coin state, even if it's false, what does that coerce into? Or even if it's tails, I mean, that coerces into true. And so whether the coin state is string heads or string tails, those are both truthy values. So we'll always res.send heads. So that's a big bug. We also have another bug. Yeah.
Is it because you have var random number into different routes?
That's fine because it'll redeclare it at every single one. Yeah.
You didn't res.send anything?
Yeah, I didn't respond. I flipped the coin, but I didn't tell the person, like, oh, by the way, I'm done flipping the coin. And so we could just do res.send. We don't even have to respond with anything. We just say, hey, we're done. And that will respond with just okay. And so let's fix it. Coin state would be true. False. And now we're good to go. Got it. So I'll go ahead and run get coin state. It's still heads, still heads, still heads. All right, now let's flip the coin. So I got a response. It's actually just saying okay. We can confirm this by actually looking at the network tab, refreshing the page, and it did. It returned 200, but it didn't actually return It just said, hey, I'm done. And now if we do get coin state, oh, still heads. All right, let's flip the coin again. Tails this time. And if I keep refreshing, it'll always be tails until I flip the coin again. Cool. Does anybody see a way to make this more efficient? Right now it's 6 lines. It's actually possible to do it in 1 line. Yeah? Ternary would work. I see an even cleaner answer. So that creates a random number, right? And if we did this, what would happen? What does math.random return? Something between 0 and 1 exclusively. So you have like a 1 in infinity chance of getting tails versus heads. But we could actually do math.round, math.random, and that takes the number and rounds it either to 0 or 1 with 50-50 odds. And that will store essentially a Boolean, a 0 or 1, in coin state. What if we wanted to store actually a Boolean? How would we do that? Yeah, there are 2 ways, right? It's not called casting, it's called coercion in JavaScript, but it's exactly casting. So what are 2 different ways we can cast this? So there's the implicit coercion and explicit coercion. So what would be the explicit way to do it? Yeah, Boolean, and then that. What would be the implicit? Does anybody know? I think you guys used it yesterday. Yeah, you could and it with we could and it with true, and that would actually work. That would be one way. What were you gonna say?
So you just like add something else to it and like assumes that one's the same and then combines them.
Yeah, so exactly. That's pretty much the same thing. If you did this, and or the Boolean and is essentially adding in bools. The shorthand way that JavaScript developers use is this. Not. So not once will turn it into the opposite Boolean, and then not again will turn that into its opposite Boolean. And so going opposite twice is where you started with, but in Boolean form. And so if you see this when you're looking at source code, that's what it's doing. This is the quick way to coerce something into a Boolean. Cool. Is there anything else? No, so we can call that the lecture time for today. Go ahead and take a 10-minute break, and then we'll be back for some exercises.